At 12,000 feet over Ostend, Belgium, on the morning of January 24th, 1944, a German 88 mm flak shell scored a direct hit on the tail section of B-17G Hang the Expense 2. Staff Sergeant Roy Urich was literally blown out of the aircraft by the explosion. A witness later reported, "I saw Roy's guns falling through the formation, and Roy's arms were still gripping them." Another crewman said, "I saw Roy's body, cut at the waist." In the cockpit, Lieutenant Frank Valesch pulled back on the control column. Nothing happened. The elevators were dead. The rudder destroyed. The tail section obliterated. 10 men aboard an aircraft that could not be flown. Valesch had been court-martialed 4 days earlier. One more mistake would destroy him. But, looking at his freezing crew, at the shattered tail, at the control column that no longer responded, he realized the manual solution, bailout, meant death over enemy territory. He would have to invent something new. 2 impossible survivals. 1 explosion. One morning over Belgium. This is the story of the tail gunner blown out at 12,000 feet, and the pilot who flew home with no elevator control. If you want to see how both men survived what should have killed them, hit that like button. It helps us share more forgotten stories like this one. Subscribe if you haven't already. Back to January 24th, 1944. Roy Urich. Staff Sergeant, Service Number 3952861. Tail Gunner, 350 1st Bombardment Squadron, 100th Bomb Group. Born and raised in Whittier, California. Working-class community in the Los Angeles suburbs. Military records contain almost nothing about his life before the war. No detailed narratives about childhood, family, profession. This is revealing in itself. Most enlisted soldiers, especially tail gunners, were conscripted citizens whose personal history was rarely documented beyond legal minimum. What we know for certain, he was competent. He'd completed multiple combat missions. He'd been decorated with Air Medal for aerial action, American Campaign Medal, European African Medal. He wasn't a rookie. He was a professional. The tail gunner position was one of the most dangerous on the aircraft. Urich knelt in a cramped space, manually operating 2 synchronized heavy machine guns. Field of fire, only plus or minus 30 degrees. He couldn't wear body armor while in position. His movements were too restricted. The operational solution: line his position with extra flak jackets. Improvised strategy that may have saved his life. His problems in combat: visibility often limited by contrails from the formation. He operated in physical isolation. An interphone failure would leave him acoustically blind. The dive speed of German fighters meant he had only fractions of a second to respond. In January 1944, the Luftwaffe still operated with ferocity. Bf-109s and Fovu 190s still caused significant losses. There are no reports of Urich being ridiculed for appearance or performance. His continued assignment on combat missions, he wasn't replaced or reassigned, suggests accepted competence. Frank Valesch, 22, 23 years old, lieutenant. Pilot of Hang the Expense 2. He'd flown at least 13-14 missions before January 24th. He knew how to handle a B-17 under pressure. But 4 days earlier, January 20th, 1944, Valesch had been convicted in court-martial for illegally carrying Red Cross women on a military aircraft. He'd been fined $100 and reprimanded. He knew another mistake would destroy him professionally. Standing between him and destruction, one successful mission to Frankfurt. Morning of January 24th, 1944. The 100th Bomb Group was assigned to bomb Frankfurt. The formation faced very strong headwinds on the return and was intentionally routed directly over an airfield near Ostend, Belgium. Ground speed 95 knots. Excessively slow. The aircraft became a stationary target. The attack occurred at 12,000 feet. A German 88mm flak battery fired. An 88mm shell had muzzle velocity 840 meters per second. Projectile, 9.4 kilograms of high explosive. Fuse calibrated to explode at specific altitude, usually time-fused. When the explosion occurred directly at the tail position, the fragmentation pattern was cataclysmic. Unlike a normal spherical explosion pattern, fragments from an 88mm fired against an aerial target have controlled fragmentation pattern. Fragments concentrate in specific directions. A direct hit on the tail creates an explosive shockwave with lethal radius 30 meters, significant fragmentation to 200 meters distance. At that exact moment, Roy Urich was leaning to speak on the radio through the interphone. This tiny detail, the body position of a person at a specific instant, determined the outcome of his life. Contemporary testimony is notable. One observer reported he saw Roy's guns falling through the formation and Roy's arms still gripping them. Another said, saw Roy's body cut at the waist. P-47 pilots who arrived minutes later reported that Urich had been ejected from the aircraft. But Roy had done two things that saved him. He'd lined his position with extra flak jackets. These absorbed initial fragmentation. He was wearing his parachute, critical, because many tail gunners in British bombers, Lancasters, couldn't carry parachutes due to space in the position. He was literally ripped from the fuselage by the flak explosion, still sitting in his bicycle seat, the kneeling position of the tail gunner, still gripping the machine gun handles. The escalation of consequence was structured in 3 levels. Level 1, destruction of aircraft. If the shockwave had hit the main fuselage 2 meters forward, it would have penetrated adjacent fuel tanks. A B-17 with separated rear fuselage is unrecoverable. All 10 crew members would have died. Level 2, loss of aircraft integrity. The impact destroyed rudder controls, elevators unusable except through autopilot. Without elevator control, a B-17 cannot be maintained in level flight. Valesch would have lost altitude rapidly, possibly allowing ejection, but at very low altitude, 12,000 feet. Only 40% survival rate for ejection at such altitude, especially under fire. Level 3, capture or death. If the aircraft were ejected over Belgium, Netherlands, hostile territory, the crew would be captured. But worse, the 2 P-47s that appeared minutes later refused to allow landing until they were over English coast. This suggested the alternative was that the aircraft would fall into the English Channel. Death by drowning for any crew member not rescued by AFCE rescue pilots. In the cockpit, Valesch experienced the cascade. First bad thing, the flak hit the tail. Urich went out in the explosion. The elevators didn't respond to normal controls. Even worse thing, when Valesch pulled the control column up, nothing happened. The aircraft pitched violently, almost entering a stall, risk of uncontrollable spin at 12,000 feet over hostile territory. John Booth, the co-pilot, would have only seconds for recovery. Absolutely desperate thing. Valesch discovered the AFCE, automatic flight control equipment, still functioned. The AFCE was the autopilot. This meant elevator control only through a low-response mechanical backup system. According to standard operating procedures of the 100th Bomb Group, Option 1, abandon. Evacuate the aircraft intact was impossible. Altitude was too low, 12,000 feet, over hostile territory, under fire. Option 2, eject and hope. Jump now, trust rescue. But the P-47s that arrived specifically refused to allow landing until over the coast, suggesting command orders preferred death and enemy fire to abandonment of aircraft in flight. Option 3, attempt to land damaged. Without elevators or rudder, a controlled landing was theoretically impossible. This wasn't in any manual. Frank Valesch, at that moment, had to choose. obey abandonment protocol, die under fire, or invent something new. Looking at his men freezing, 10,000 to 15,000 meters equals 40 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. Seeing the destroyed rear fuselage with dead elevators and with only control via autopilot, Valesch had to decide. The report from Dick Johnson, navigator, captures this moment. The aircraft nosed up sharply, and Frank, fearing a stall and a spin, gave the order to stand by to bail out. However, he snapped on the AFCE, automatic pilot, and found he had elevator control by these means. In that second of testing, activating the AFCE and feeling elevator response, Valesch understood the aircraft could be brought back. He immediately rescinded the bailout order and said, "Stick around." This was not a heroic decision in the romantic sense. It was a technical decision based on rapid testing of an alternative system. Valesch had 10 to 15 seconds to test the AFCE before losing altitude or entering a spin. Frank Valesch did something not taught in any operational manual on record. He activated the AFCE, automatic flight control equipment, and maintained the aircraft flying using only aileron control via control column, elevator control via AFCE autopilot, no rudder. This is technically viable because a B-17 in bombing formation has constant airspeed 130 to 140 miles per hour. The AFCC was designed to maintain attitude and altitude in level flight. The formation was returning to English coast in straight route, no maneuvers requiring rudder. The physics, when Valesch activated autopilot for pitch control while manually controlling roll with ailerons, he created a hybrid control system. The autopilot maintained nose-up or nose-down attitude. He steered left or right with wing banking. Without rudder, every turn was unstable, requiring constant correction through elevators. Johnson, the navigator, plotted the shortest route to English coast. The two P-47s that appeared began buzzing Eastchurch RAF airfield to keep it clear. The aircraft flew from 12,000 feet to the coast in severe pitching conditions, a barely controllable airplane because the rudder didn't function. Each turn needed to be made with aileron only, an unstable maneuver requiring constant correction through elevators. What prior learning saved him? There's no record that Valesch had specific childhood linked to this improvisation, but his training in aviation cadet and his previous flight experience, he'd flown at least 13-14 missions before, prepared him mentally to test systems rapidly under pressure. His previous flight with burning engine combustion on December 30th, 1943, had taught him that mechanical problems had unconventional solutions. Meanwhile, Roy Urich was falling, 12,000 feet, body ejected by 88mm explosion, still in his bicycle seat, still gripping machine gun handles. Temperature at altitude 40 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. Air thin enough to cause hypoxia in seconds. But he had his parachute. He pulled the ripcord. Canopy deployed. Descent slowed from terminal velocity 120 miles per hour to approximately 15 miles per hour under canopy. He had minutes to think, minutes to realize he was descending into enemy territory, minutes to know that if he survived the landing, capture was certain. He landed. German forces found him. The report from Johnson indicates he had a deep cut on his head that required medical attention. He was held in POW camp for the rest of the war. Months later, Urich sent a postcard to his crew. "I'm a prisoner, but I'm okay." That was all Johnson knew until many years later when Urich and I still correspond. There's no mention that Urich received any decoration, not air medal, nothing. His disappearance from the aircraft, although miraculously survived, placed him in the category of missing aircrewmen until his POW status was confirmed. At that time, military bureaucracy didn't recognize impossible survival. Back over Belgium, Valesch fought the aircraft home. The B-17, Hang the Expense 2, serial 42-39867, flew with destroyed tail section, no elevator control except through autopilot, no rudder, over 100 miles to English coast. The P-47s refused to allow landing until coastal airfield. They buzzed Eastchurch RAF repeatedly. Tower cleared runway. Crash crews stood by. Valesch aligned approach. Without flaps, speed excessive. Britain and Valesch both on the yoke, maximum force. The aircraft touched down fast, above normal speed. Landing was rough but controlled. The aircraft rolled to a stop. All 9 remaining crew members survived. After flying the burning aircraft back to England on January 24th, Valesch was kept separated from his crew as punitive measure for 2 weeks. Dick Johnson, the navigator, remained bitter decades later. I guess I have never fully forgiven them in my heart, and I'm still sore that Valesch and Booth did not get a medal for bringing that airplane home. Standard procedure was to decorate pilots for heroic action when bringing severely damaged aircraft back. The 100th Bomb Group had decorated other pilots in similar circumstances. But there's no record of Valesch receiving an Air Medal or Distinguished Flying Cross for this feat. His subsequent promotion to lead pilot occurred without mention of the Frankfurt incident. This was the injustice. Not just that Valesch didn't receive a medal, but that his technical survival method was never formalized and taught. A later pilot in similar circumstance didn't have the benefit of knowing that a damaged autopilot could be repaired to provide elevator control. The Frankfurt incident was rare enough to be memorable, but not so rare to enter military doctrine. There's no evidence that Valesch's method, autopilot as backup elevator in case of critical damage, was adopted in subsequent emergency procedures. Hang the Expense 2 was repaired and returned to service, completing operations until 1945 when it was returned to the United States. The aircraft was redesignated Boeing Bell by its next crew, suggesting the Frankfurt incident was widely known among group personnel. Frank Valesch lived until 1984. He returned to St. Paul, Minnesota, where he worked as manager of the farmers market until 1983. His combat feats were largely unknown. Well known for being a gregarious person, he seldom spoke about the war, and many of his friends never knew the story of Hang the Expense. His ambition was to live quietly, but his combat experience haunted him. Valesch married Helen Regal in 1983, finally finding peace. Roy Urich and Dick Johnson maintained correspondence over the years, suggesting a survivor's bond that transcended the war. This incident reveals how the history of aerial warfare is not about heroes, but about competence under extreme pressure. Roy Urich didn't choose to be ejected from an aircraft. Frank Valesch didn't choose a court-martial 4 days before his greatest test. But both survived because Urich lined his position with additional protection, low-rank survival initiative. Valesch rapidly tested a backup system under imminent death pressure. Johnson navigated with precision. Booth maintained calm. The injustice was not just that Valesch didn't receive a medal, but that his technical survival method was never formalized and taught. A subsequent pilot in similar circumstance didn't have the benefit of knowing this solution existed. It's the story of how small failures in recognition and documentation create gaps in institutional memory that cost lives. On January 24th, 1944, at 12,000 feet over Ostend, Belgium, an 88mm shell destroyed the tail of Hang the Expense 2. Roy Urich was blown out. Frank Valesch discovered his elevators were dead. Both should have died. Neither did. Urich descended under parachute into German hands. Spent the rest of the war as POW. Received no recognition. Valesch flew home using autopilot as improvised elevator control. Brought 9 men back alive. Was punished with 2 weeks separation from his crew. Received no medal. Both men proved that sometimes survival is not about heroism. It's about improvisation under pressure. Sometimes the system fails you twice, once when it tries to kill you, once when it refuses to recognize that you survived. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor. Hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We rescue forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about tail gunners blown out at 12,000 feet. Pilots who flew the unflyable. Real people, real survival. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. You're not just a viewer. You're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure Roy Urich and Frank Valesch do not disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen.